The auditorium had been silent for a full minute, but Professor Helena Martineau was still staring at the program in her hands when I heard her whisper to her colleague, Dr. Richard Pemberton, that it couldn't possibly be the same girl. The same talentless child who had wasted 3 years of her time before finally giving up on music altogether. They thought I couldn't hear them over the rustling of evening gowns and tuxedos that filled the Boston Symphony Hall, but years of training your ear for the subtlest musical nuances also sharpens your ability to catch the cruelest conversations. Tonight was the opening gala for the newly renovated Berkshire Performance Center, and Professor Martineau had just realized that the conductor listed in the program shared a name with her former student. What she didn't know was that while she was trying to convince herself it was merely a coincidence, she was about to witness the most expensive musical demonstration of her career. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sophia Reyes, and until that crisp November evening in Boston, I had managed to keep two completely different worlds from ever intersecting. To the classical music establishment, where I had spent my childhood, I was the girl who couldn't keep time, couldn't read music properly, and had been gently but firmly encouraged to pursue other interests, after 3 years of expensive private lessons had yielded no meaningful progress. To the rest of the world, I was the founder and artistic director of Harmonic Ventures, a music production company that had revolutionized how classical music was recorded, distributed, and funded in the digital age. But I had never bothered to correct the assumptions that my former teachers and their colleagues had made about my musical abilities, partly because I had learned that some people would rather be right about your limitations than surprised by your capabilities. The morning of the gala, I had dressed carefully in a simple black evening gown from a boutique in Cambridge, styled my hair in an elegant upward twist, and chosen understated pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. I wanted to look professional but not ostentatious, successful but not flashy. My grandmother had been a pianist herself, though she had never pursued it professionally, and she had taught me that true artistry spoke through the music, not through the performance of being a musician. She would have appreciated the irony of what was about to unfold. Professor Martineau had been my piano instructor at the prestigious Whitmore Conservatory from ages 8 to 11, 3 years during which she had repeatedly informed my parents that I lacked the fundamental musical intelligence required for serious study. According to her careful assessments, I couldn't hear intervals correctly, I had no sense of rhythm, my fingers lacked the independence necessary for complex passages, and my musical interpretation was mechanical and emotionless. She had delivered these evaluations with the clinical precision of someone who believed she was providing an important service to families who might otherwise waste money on lessons for untalented children. My parents had been devastated by her conclusions, partly because they had invested significant money in my musical education and partly because they had genuinely believed I showed promise. My mother had been the one to first notice that I would sit at our old upright piano for hours, picking out melodies by ear and creating simple harmonies that seemed to come naturally to me. My father had been the one to suggest professional lessons, thinking that proper instruction would help me develop whatever gift I seemed to possess. Neither of them had been prepared for Professor Martineau's systematic demolition of their confidence in my abilities. What my parents didn't understand, and what Professor Martineau refused to consider, was that I learned music differently than her traditional methods could accommodate. I didn't read standard notation fluently because I processed musical information through patterns and relationships, rather than individual notes on a staff. I couldn't perform the technical exercises she assigned because they felt disconnected from actual musical expression. I appeared to have no sense of rhythm during her lessons, because her metronome-based approach to timing felt mechanical and lifeless to me. But put me in front of a piano without sheet music, without exercises, without her critical observation, and I could improvise melodies that moved people to tears. During my 3 years of study with Professor Martineau, I had tried repeatedly to explain that I understood music differently, that I could hear things in compositions that weren't written in the score, that I could feel structural relationships between movements that weren't explicitly taught in theory classes. She had dismissed these claims as the wishful thinking of a child who was trying to compensate for her obvious deficiencies in fundamental skills. According to her assessment, real musical talent manifested in the ability to execute technical exercises with precision and to interpret written notation with accuracy. Everything else was amateur enthusiasm, masquerading as genuine ability. The breaking point had come during my final recital at Whitmore, a performance that was supposed to demonstrate 3 years of progress to parents and other faculty members. Professor Martineau had assigned me a Bach invention that was technically within my supposed skill level, but musically complex enough to showcase whatever interpretive abilities I might have developed. I had practiced the piece for months, not just learning the notes but understanding the mathematical relationships that made Bach's compositions so structurally elegant. During my performance, I had made the choice to emphasize those relationships through subtle tempo variations and dynamic changes that weren't written in the score but that highlighted the invention's intricate voice leading. Professor Martineau had been furious. After my performance, she had informed my parents that I had completely failed to follow the written music, that I had imposed my own arbitrary interpretations on a masterpiece that required faithful execution, and that my inability to simply play what was written demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for musical tradition. According to her final evaluation, I would never develop into a serious musician because I couldn't distinguish between personal preference and musical accuracy. My parents had been embarrassed and disappointed, not just in me but in their own judgment about my potential. They had apologized to Professor Martineau for the time I had wasted, had paid for my final semester without complaint, and had quietly enrolled me in soccer and art classes instead of continuing with music. I had been 11 years old, devastated by the loss of something I loved, but also secretly relieved to escape the weekly humiliation of lessons, where everything I did naturally was treated as evidence of my inadequacy. What Professor Martineau had never bothered to discover was that I had continued playing music on my own. Without her supervision or criticism, I had developed my ability to improvise, to arrange existing pieces in ways that revealed new harmonic possibilities, to compose simple melodies that captured emotions I couldn't express in words. By the time I was 15, I was quietly playing piano for my church's contemporary service, creating arrangements of hymns that blended traditional melodies with modern harmonies. By the time I was 18, I was writing and producing music for local theater productions, developing a reputation in Boston's independent arts community for creating soundscapes that enhanced dramatic performances in unexpected ways. During college at Boston University, where I studied business administration with a minor in music theory, I had started a small company that provided musical consulting services for local restaurants and retail establishments. I specialized in creating ambient musical environments that enhanced customer experiences without drawing attention to themselves. The work required me to understand how different musical elements affected mood and behavior, how tempo and key signatures influenced purchasing decisions, how to create musical programming that supported specific business objectives. It was exactly the kind of practical application of musical knowledge that Professor Martineau would have dismissed as commercial rather than artistic. But it was also extremely profitable, and it was helping me understand music as a complex system with psychological and economic dimensions that went far beyond technical execution. By my senior year of college, my musical consulting business had grown to include clients in 6 states, and I was generating enough revenue to pay for my education without student loans. More importantly, I was learning that my unconventional approach to understanding music was actually a significant advantage in commercial applications. My ability to hear structural relationships that weren't obvious from written notation helped me create musical arrangements that supported specific emotional responses. My tendency to think about tempo and rhythm in terms of psychological impact rather than mathematical precision helped me design musical environments that influenced behavior in measurable ways. My inclination to improvise and adapt, rather than simply execute written music, helped me respond to client needs in real time during recording sessions and live events. After graduation, I had been offered a position with a major music production company in Los Angeles, but I had decided to stay in Boston and expand my own business instead. I understood the music industry well enough to know that my approach to musical analysis and composition was valuable, but I also understood that my lack of traditional conservatory credentials would limit my opportunities within established institutions. Rather than fighting for acceptance in a system that valued formal training over practical results, I had chosen to build my own system where results were the only credential that mattered. Harmonic Ventures had started as a simple extension of my college consulting work, but within 5 years it had evolved into something much more comprehensive. We provided complete musical production services for everything from corporate presentations to independent films, from retail environments to therapeutic applications. We had developed proprietary software that analyzed the psychological and emotional effects of different musical elements, allowing us to create compositions that achieved specific objectives with scientific precision. We had assembled a team of musicians, composers, and sound engineers who shared my belief that music was most powerful when it served purposes beyond mere entertainment. The breakthrough that had transformed Harmonic Ventures from a successful regional business into a major industry player had come when we were hired to provide musical scoring for a documentary about veterans with PTSD. The project had required us to create musical compositions that could facilitate therapeutic outcomes while supporting the narrative structure of the film. Working with psychologists and trauma specialists, we had developed a new approach to musical therapy that used carefully designed soundscapes to help patients process difficult emotions and memories. The documentary had won several awards, but more importantly, our musical therapy techniques had been adopted by treatment centers across the country. That success had led to contracts with major healthcare systems, educational institutions, and corporate wellness programs. We were creating musical interventions that helped surgeons maintain focus during long operations, that helped students improve concentration during standardized testing, that helped employees manage stress during high-pressure work environments. Our work was being studied by researchers at Harvard Medical School, MIT, and Stanford University, and our techniques were being implemented in hospitals, schools, and offices throughout North America and Europe. The financial success of these innovations had been substantial, but more satisfying than the money was the knowledge that music I had created was genuinely helping people. The compositions we developed for surgical suites were reducing medical errors and improving patient outcomes. The soundscapes we designed for educational environments were helping students with learning differences achieve better academic results. The ambient musical programs we created for corporate wellness initiatives were reducing employee burnout and improving workplace satisfaction. Every project validated my belief that music could be far more than entertainment, that it could be a tool for healing, learning, and human improvement. By the time I was 30, Harmonic Ventures was generating annual revenues of over $12 million, and I personally owned 70% of the company. I had been featured in business magazines as one of the most innovative entrepreneurs in the digital music industry, and I had been invited to speak at conferences about the intersection of music, technology, and human psychology. Universities were beginning to offer courses based on research we had conducted, and several major technology companies were licensing our analytical software for their own product development. But despite this success, I had never felt any desire to reconnect with the classical music establishment that had rejected me as a child. Professor Martineau and her colleagues represented a world that valued tradition over innovation, that measured musical worth through technical perfection rather than practical impact. They created beautiful art for small audiences of people who already appreciated classical music, while I was creating functional art that improved the lives of people who might never attend a symphony concert. Both approaches had value, but I had no interest in proving myself to people who had already decided I lacked the fundamental qualifications for their approval. That had been my attitude until the Boston Symphony Orchestra had approached Harmonic Ventures about a collaboration that would change everything. The symphony was facing the same challenges that were affecting classical music institutions worldwide: declining audiences, reduced funding, competition from digital entertainment options, and difficulty attracting younger listeners who didn't have traditional classical music education. Their board of directors had hired a consulting firm to explore innovative approaches to community engagement, and that firm had recommended partnering with companies like mine that understood how to make classical music accessible to broader audiences. The initial project had been modest, designing ambient musical experiences for the Symphony Hall's public spaces that would help new audiences feel more comfortable and engaged during their visits. But as we worked together, the collaboration had expanded into something much more ambitious. The symphony was planning a major renovation of their performance spaces, and they wanted to incorporate technologies that would enhance both the acoustic experience for audiences and the performance experience for musicians. They needed partners who understood both classical music traditions and cutting-edge audio technologies, who could bridge the gap between artistic excellence and practical innovation. The renovation project had been so successful that the symphony had invited us to design the complete audio systems for their new education and community outreach center. When that project had also exceeded expectations, they had asked us to consult on the acoustic design for a new performance venue they were planning in Western Massachusetts. The Berkshire Performance Center was envisioned as a smaller, more intimate space that would specifically focus on chamber music and solo performances, with state-of-the-art recording capabilities that would allow performances to be simultaneously broadcast to remote audiences. As our involvement in the Berkshire project had deepened, I had found myself taking on more comprehensive responsibilities for the venue's development. The Symphony's board had been impressed not just with our technical expertise, but with our understanding of how musical experiences could be enhanced through thoughtful environmental design. They had asked me to serve as the project's artistic consultant, responsible for ensuring that every aspect of the venue supported optimal musical expression and audience engagement. The role had required me to work closely with architects, acousticians, and technology specialists, but it had also required me to make artistic decisions about programming, performer selection, and audience development strategies. For the first time since my childhood lessons with Professor Martineau, I was working directly within the classical music establishment. But this time, I was working as an expert rather than a student, as someone whose opinions were valued rather than someone whose limitations were being cataloged. The experience had been both exhilarating and challenging. Many of the musicians, conductors, and administrators I worked with had extensive conservatory training and decades of experience within traditional classical music institutions. They spoke a language of musical terminology and theoretical concepts that I had learned independently rather than through formal study, and they often assumed that anyone working at my level would share their educational background and cultural references. Initially, I had felt self-conscious about my unconventional path into their world, uncertain about whether my practical knowledge could match their theoretical expertise. But as we worked together on the Berkshire project, I began to realize that my outsider perspective was actually providing valuable insights that complemented their traditional training. While they understood classical music traditions with scholarly depth, I understood audience psychology and technological possibilities in ways that enhanced rather than threatened their artistic vision. The renovation process had taken 3 years and had cost significantly more than the symphony's original budget had anticipated. As the project had expanded in scope and ambition, funding had become increasingly challenging. Corporate sponsors had provided substantial support, but the symphony had struggled to find sources for the final phase of development, which included the advanced acoustic technologies and recording equipment that would distinguish the Berkshire Center from other performance venues. That was when I had made the decision that would ultimately lead to tonight's revelation. Using resources from Harmonic Ventures and my personal investment portfolio, I had quietly provided the funding necessary to complete the project according to our original vision. The donation had been structured as an anonymous gift, partly because I preferred to keep my financial contributions private, and partly because I didn't want my funding to influence artistic decisions about programming or personnel. The symphony's board knew that a private donor had made the final phase of construction possible, but they had no idea that the donor was someone they had been working with professionally for 3 years. My decision to fund the project's completion had been partly practical and partly personal. From a business perspective, the Berkshire Performance Center represented exactly the kind of innovation that would advance Harmonic Ventures' reputation within the classical music industry. Having our technology showcased in a world-class performance venue would demonstrate our capabilities to potential clients worldwide and would establish us as leaders in the integration of classical music traditions with cutting-edge audio innovations. But the decision had also been deeply personal. Working on the Berkshire project had allowed me to reconnect with the part of myself that had fallen in love with classical music as a child, before Professor Martineau's criticism had convinced me that my love was inappropriate, because it wasn't technically sophisticated enough to qualify as genuine appreciation. The Performance Center represented a space where musical excellence and technological innovation could coexist, where traditional artistry and practical application could enhance each other rather than competing for legitimacy. More importantly, the center was designed to serve exactly the kind of musical programming that I had always found most compelling performances that emphasized emotional connection over technical display, interpretations that revealed new possibilities in familiar compositions, collaborations between classical musicians and artists from other genres who brought fresh perspectives to traditional repertoire. The Berkshire Performance Center was everything I had hoped classical music could become when I was 11 years old, and devastated by my exclusion from Professor Martineau's world. Tonight's opening gala was intended to showcase the center's capabilities to major donors, music critics, and classical music professionals from throughout New England. The program included performances by soloists from the Boston Symphony, chamber music pieces that demonstrated the hall's intimate acoustic properties, and a concluding performance that would highlight the venue's recording and broadcast technologies. As the project's artistic consultant, I had been involved in planning every aspect of the evening, from performer selection to technical coordination to audience engagement strategies. What I hadn't anticipated was that Professor Martineau would be among the invited guests. As a faculty member at Whitmore Conservatory and a respected member of Boston's classical music community, she had received an invitation to the gala along with other local music educators and critics. When I had seen her name on the guest list 2 weeks earlier, I had considered whether to let the symphony's staff know about our history, but I had ultimately decided that my childhood experience with her was irrelevant to the evening's objectives. Besides, I had reasoned there was no particular reason to expect that she would remember me or make any connection between her former student Sophia Reyes and the artistic consultant listed in the program materials. Nearly 20 years had passed since our last interaction, and I had been one of hundreds of students she had taught during her career. The possibility that she would recognize my name or face seemed remote, and even if she did, I had assumed she would simply be surprised to learn that her former student had found success in a music-related field. I had not anticipated that seeing my name in the program would trigger such a strong reaction from her, or that she would be so determined to convince herself and others that there must be some mistake. As I watched her from across the Symphony Hall's elegant lobby during the pre-performance reception, I could see her repeatedly checking the program and discussing my presence with other faculty members from Whitmore. Her behavior suggested that my name was not only familiar to her but was actively disturbing to her in ways I didn't fully understand. Dr. Pemberton, who was standing beside Professor Martineau near the reception's elegant string quartet, had been her colleague at Whitmore for over 15 years and served as the conservatory's director of academic affairs. He was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of being recognized as an authority in his field. During my childhood, he had never taught me directly, but I remembered him from student recitals and conservatory events, where he would offer brief, polite comments to parents about their children's progress. Professor Martineau was a woman in her early 60s with perfectly styled gray hair, and the ramrod posture of someone who had spent decades teaching young musicians to sit up straight at the piano bench. She was wearing an elegant navy blue evening gown with a pearl necklace that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Despite her refined appearance, there was something sharp and brittle about her expression, as if she was perpetually evaluating everyone around her and finding them slightly disappointing. As I moved through the reception, accepting congratulations from symphony board members and discussing technical details with the evening's performers, I could feel Professor Martineau's attention following me. Several times I caught her staring at me with an expression of confused recognition, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together properly. When other guests approached me to discuss the Performance Center or Harmonic Ventures work, she positioned herself nearby, clearly listening to conversations that might provide clues about my identity and background. The symphony's music director, Maestro Chen Wei, had been particularly complimentary about the acoustic innovations we had developed for the center. During our conversation near the reception's grand piano, he had explained to a small group of guests how our technological enhancements were allowing musicians to hear themselves and each other with unprecedented clarity, and how the recording capabilities were capturing sonic details that had never been possible in traditional performance venues. Ms. Reyes has revolutionized how we think about the relationship between performance space and musical expression, Maestro Chen had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinions shaped classical music programming throughout New England. Her understanding of acoustic psychology has allowed us to create an environment where musicians can achieve their highest level of artistic expression, while audiences experience music with extraordinary intimacy and immediacy. Professor Martineau had moved closer during this conversation, and I could see her studying my face with increasing intensity. When Maestro Chen had mentioned my work with the symphony orchestra, she had stepped forward slightly, as if preparing to join the discussion, but then had seemed to think better of it, and had remained silent on the periphery of our group. The moment that had finally triggered her recognition had come when Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the symphony's principal flutist and a longtime friend of mine, had approached our group with her usual warm enthusiasm. Dr. Morrison and I had worked together on several Harmonic Ventures projects over the years, and she had been instrumental in helping me understand the practical needs of professional classical musicians when designing our audio technologies. Sophia, I have to tell you how thrilled the orchestra members are about tonight's performance, Dr. Morrison had said, embracing me with the kind of genuine affection that comes from years of successful professional collaboration. The musicians have been rehearsing in the new space all week, and everyone is saying it's like discovering new dimensions in pieces they've performed hundreds of times. The acoustic clarity is extraordinary, but more than that, the emotional intimacy you've created in that performance environment is allowing us to connect with the music in ways we never anticipated. She had continued, I know you always say that you're just providing technical support, but what you've created here is genuinely artistic. The way you've designed the acoustic relationships in that hall reflects a deep understanding of musical expression that goes far beyond technical expertise. You're not just a brilliant businesswoman and innovator, you're a musician in the truest sense of the word. That was when Professor Martineau had stepped forward, her voice cutting through the conversation with the kind of authoritative tone she had always used to command attention in academic settings. Excuse me, Ms. Reyes, but I have to ask, are you by any chance related to a young girl named Sophia Reyes who studied piano at Whitmore Conservatory about 20 years ago? The question had created an immediate silence in our small group, not because anyone understood the significance of the connection, but because Professor Martineau's tone had carried an undercurrent of challenge that suggested this was more than casual curiosity. I had looked at her carefully, noting the way her eyes had narrowed slightly as she studied my face, the way her posture had become even more rigid than usual, the way her hands had tightened on her evening clutch purse. I am that person, I had replied simply, watching her expression shift from uncertainty to shock to something that looked almost like betrayal. Dr. Morrison had looked confused by the sudden tension in our conversation. Helena, do you know Sophia from somewhere else? I had no idea you two had a previous connection. Professor Martineau had been quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to respond to this revelation in front of colleagues who respected my work and valued my contributions to the classical music community. Finally, she had managed to say, Ms. Reyes was one of my piano students many years ago, though she left the program before completing her studies. The careful phrasing had been typical of Professor Martineau's approach to difficult conversations, diplomatic enough to avoid obvious conflict but structured in a way that implied criticism without stating it directly. By saying that I had left the program before completing my studies, she had managed to suggest that my departure from Whitmore had been due to some failure or inadequacy on my part, rather than acknowledging that she had actively discouraged my continued participation in classical music education. Maestro Chen had looked intrigued by this revelation. How wonderful that you have such a long-standing connection to our community, Helena. You must be very proud to see how Sophia has developed her musical career. Her innovations in acoustic psychology are being studied by researchers worldwide, and her work with us has demonstrated possibilities for classical music presentation that we never imagined before. I had watched Professor Martineau's face as she processed this information, trying to reconcile her memories of me as a talentless child with the professional success that her colleagues were describing. Her expression had moved through several phases: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked suspiciously like irritation, as if my success was somehow a personal affront to her professional judgment. I'm sure Ms. Reyes has found success in her chosen field, Professor Martineau had said carefully, though I have to admit I'm surprised to learn that she continued with music after leaving Whitmore. When she was my student, she showed very little aptitude for traditional musical study. I wouldn't have predicted that she would pursue music professionally. The comment had hung in the air like a discordant note, creating the kind of awkward silence that happens when someone says something that reveals more about themselves than they intended. Dr. Morrison had looked genuinely shocked by the implied criticism, and Maestro Chen had raised his eyebrows in an expression of polite disbelief. Dr. Morrison had been the first to break the silence. "Helena, I think there might be some misunderstanding about Sophia's musical background. She's not just successful in a music-related field, she's one of the most innovative musical minds of her generation. Her compositions for therapeutic applications have been adopted by medical institutions worldwide, and her analytical work on acoustic psychology has influenced everything from concert hall design to educational methodology." Professor Martineau had looked even more confused by this information. "Compositions? Ms. Reyes composes music? When she was my student, she could barely read notation properly, much less create original compositions." Maestro Chen had stepped forward slightly, his voice taking on the kind of protective tone he typically used when defending his musicians from unfair criticism. "Helena, I think you may be underestimating Sophia's abilities. Her compositions for our therapy programs have been performed by world-class musicians, and her arrangements of classical pieces for our educational outreach programs have introduced thousands of young people to symphonic music. She may not have traditional conservatory training, but her musical intelligence is undeniable." I had decided to intervene before the conversation became more uncomfortable for everyone involved. "Professor Martineau, I think there's been some confusion. When I was your student, I was learning music very differently than your methods could accommodate. That doesn't mean either of us was wrong, it just means we weren't compatible as teacher and student." Professor Martineau had studied my face carefully, as if trying to determine whether I was being diplomatic or whether I genuinely believed what I was saying. "Ms. Reyes, I remember your lessons quite clearly. You consistently struggled with basic technical exercises, you had difficulty maintaining steady tempo, and your interpretation of classical pieces lacked the precision that serious musical study requires. I'm not sure how that translates into the kind of professional success these colleagues are describing." The challenge in her voice had been unmistakable, and I had realized that this conversation was no longer about resolving confusion or celebrating professional success. Professor Martineau was questioning not just my musical abilities but the judgment of my current colleagues, implying that their assessment of my work must be somehow flawed or misguided because it contradicted her evaluation of my childhood potential. Dr. Morrison had looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Helena, I've worked with Sophia on dozens of projects over the past several years. I've watched her analyze complex orchestral scores, create arrangements that reveal new harmonic possibilities in familiar pieces, and compose original music that achieves specific therapeutic and educational objectives with remarkable precision. I'm not sure how childhood piano lessons relate to her current professional capabilities." Professor Martineau had seemed determined to maintain her position despite the growing evidence that her colleagues disagreed with her assessment. "Elizabeth, I'm not questioning Ms. Reyes's business success or her technological innovations. I'm simply observing that when she was my student, she demonstrated none of the fundamental musical abilities that would typically predict success in serious musical endeavors. Her ear training was poor, her technical execution was inconsistent, and her understanding of musical theory was rudimentary at best." That was when I had decided that this conversation needed to move beyond diplomatic pleasantries. Professor Martineau was not simply expressing surprise about my career development. She was actively questioning my musical competence in front of colleagues whose respect and collaboration were important to my professional relationships. Her comments were threatening to undermine not just my personal reputation but the credibility of the work we had accomplished together. "Professor Martineau," I had said, my voice remaining calm but becoming more direct, "I think we may be operating from different definitions of musical ability. When I was your student, you measured musical talent through technical precision and faithful interpretation of written notation. Those are certainly important skills, but they represent only one approach to understanding and creating music." She had looked skeptical. "Ms. Reyes, musical ability is not subjective. There are established standards for evaluating technical competence, theoretical knowledge, and interpretive sophistication. These standards exist because they reflect centuries of musical tradition and pedagogy." "I agree that technical standards are important," I had replied, "but musical intelligence encompasses much more than technical execution." pattern recognition, harmonic analysis, structural composition, acoustic psychology. These are all forms of musical knowledge that don't necessarily manifest through traditional conservatory training methods. Maestro Chen had nodded approvingly. Sophia is absolutely correct. Some of our most innovative musicians are those who bring unconventional perspectives to classical traditions. Her work with us has demonstrated that musical intelligence can express itself through many different channels, not all of which are captured by traditional educational approaches. Professor Martineau had looked around our small group as if realizing for the first time that she was outnumbered in this discussion, that her colleagues were supporting my perspective rather than deferring to her expertise. Her expression had shifted to something that looked almost defensive, as if our disagreement with her assessment was somehow a personal attack on her professional judgment. I suppose, she had said carefully, that different types of musical work require different types of abilities. Perhaps Ms. Reyes has found applications for her interests that are more suited to her particular strengths than traditional classical performance would have been. The comment had been structured as a concession, but it had carried an unmistakable undertone of condescension. By suggesting that my work was simply more suited to my particular strengths, Professor Martineau had managed to imply that those strengths were somehow lesser than the abilities required for traditional classical performance. She was acknowledging my professional success while simultaneously diminishing its significance within the hierarchy of musical accomplishment that she represented. Dr. Morrison had clearly caught the implication, and her response had been swift and pointed. Helena, I think you're misunderstanding the scope and significance of Sophia's musical work. She's not just applying musical interests to alternative fields, she's advancing our understanding of music itself. Her research on acoustic psychology has influenced how we think about musical expression, and her compositional work has expanded our conception of what classical music can accomplish. But before Professor Martineau could respond to Dr. Morrison's defense, the symphony's development director, Ms. Caroline Foster, had approached our group with news that would completely change the trajectory of our conversation. Ms. Foster was an energetic woman in her 40s, who had been responsible for managing the complex fundraising campaign that had made the Berkshire Performance Center possible. She had been working closely with major donors throughout the evening, ensuring that they felt appropriately recognized for their contributions to the project. Sophia, I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms. Foster had said, but I wanted to let you know that we've just received final confirmation from the anonymous donor who funded the last phase of construction. They've agreed to be publicly acknowledged during tonight's program, and they've asked specifically to meet with you after the performance to discuss future collaboration possibilities. She had continued with obvious excitement. This is such wonderful news for the symphony and for the Performance Center. Having our major benefactor express interest in ongoing partnership opens up so many possibilities for expanded programming and community outreach initiatives. Professor Martineau had looked confused by Ms. Foster's comments. Anonymous donor? I thought the renovation funding came from corporate sponsors and foundation grants. Ms. Foster had shaken her head. The initial phases were funded through traditional sources, but the final phase required a much larger investment than we could raise through conventional fundraising. We were about to scale back significantly on the acoustic technologies and recording equipment, when an anonymous donor stepped forward with a gift that allowed us to complete the project according to our original vision. How much money are we talking about? Dr. Pemberton had asked, clearly intrigued by the financial details of the project. Miss Foster had glanced around our group as if to make sure she wasn't revealing confidential information, then had said, the anonymous donation was $8.5 million. It covered all the advanced acoustic systems, the digital recording equipment, the broadcast technologies, and the instrument acquisition fund that will allow us to provide world-class instruments for visiting artists. The number had hit our small group like a thunderclap. Even in the context of major symphony fundraising campaigns, an $8.5 million gift from a single donor was extraordinary. Professor Martineau had stared at Ms. Foster as if she had announced that aliens had funded the concert hall, while Dr. Morrison and Maestro Chen had exchanged glances that suggested they were as surprised as everyone else by the magnitude of the donation. Do we know anything about this donor? Maestro Chen had asked. Someone willing to make that kind of investment in classical music programming must have serious connections to our community. Ms. Foster had smiled mysteriously. That's what makes tonight so exciting. We've been working with intermediaries throughout the funding process, so this will be the first time any of us meet our benefactor face to face. All we know is that they specifically requested to meet with Sophia after tonight's performance, which suggests they're familiar with her work on the project. I had felt my heart begin to race as I realized that Ms. Foster was about to reveal information that would completely recontextualize everything Professor Martineau thought she knew about my musical career and my place within the classical music establishment. The anonymous donor she was describing, the benefactor who had made the Berkshire Performance Center possible, was standing right in front of her participating in a conversation about my supposed lack of musical talent. Professor Martineau had been studying my face during Ms. Foster's explanation, and I could see growing suspicion in her expression. There was something about my reaction to the news about the donor that was making her question whether this conversation was as straightforward as it appeared to be. "Ms. Reyes," she had said slowly, "you seem remarkably calm about meeting this mysterious benefactor. Most people would be more curious about someone who has such a significant interest in their professional work." The observation had been perceptive, and I had realized that Professor Martineau was beginning to suspect that there was more to this situation than simple coincidence. Her years of teaching had trained her to notice subtle signs of discomfort or deception in her students, and she was applying those observational skills to our current conversation. Dr. Morrison had looked at me with sudden understanding dawning in her expression. As someone who had worked closely with me on the Berkshire project, she knew more about my financial investments and business relationships than most of my other professional colleagues. She had also been present during several conversations where symphony staff had discussed the mysterious donor who had made the project's completion possible. "Sophia," Dr. Morrison had said carefully, "the donor wants to meet with you specifically because they know your work on this project. That suggests they've been following your career for some time, doesn't it?" The question had been structured as a gentle probe, giving me the opportunity to explain the situation without forcing me to reveal more than I was comfortable sharing. But I had realized that continuing to pretend ignorance about the donor's identity would be difficult to maintain, especially if Professor Martineau continued to analyze my responses for signs of deception. Maestro Chen had been watching our exchange with growing interest. "There's something else interesting about this timing," he had said thoughtfully. "The donor's decision to reveal themselves tonight, specifically after watching tonight's performances in the space they funded. This suggests they want to see how their investment has turned out before committing to future collaborations." Ms. Foster had nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Tonight's gala isn't just celebrating the completion of the Performance Center, it's essentially an audition for future funding opportunities. If our benefactor is pleased with what they see tonight, we could be looking at ongoing support for expanded programming, educational initiatives, community outreach, even potential touring opportunities." The conversation was moving toward territory that would make it increasingly difficult for me to maintain my anonymity about the donation. Professor Martineau was clearly suspicious about my knowledge of the donor's identity. Dr. Morrison was beginning to piece together the truth from her familiarity with my business relationships, and Ms. Foster was inadvertently providing details that pointed toward my involvement in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had been saved from having to decide how much to reveal by the symphony's general manager, Mr. James Crawford, who had approached our group with an announcement that it was time for guests to move into the performance hall for the evening's program. The conversation about the anonymous donor had been temporarily suspended as we followed the elegant crowd of patrons, musicians, and music industry professionals into the Berkshire Performance Center's main auditorium. The performance hall that we entered was everything I had hoped it would become when we had begun designing the space 3 years earlier. The intimate seating arrangement allowed for only 250 guests, creating the kind of closeness between performers and audience that was impossible in larger venues. The acoustic design incorporated innovations that enhanced both the clarity of individual instruments and the blend of ensemble pieces, while the subtle lighting systems had been specifically calibrated to support optimal visual focus without creating glare or distraction. As guests found their seats, I had been struck by the realization that this was the first time I was experiencing the Performance Center as an audience member, rather than as a consultant or project manager. For 3 years, I had visited this space dozens of times during construction, acoustic testing, and technical installation, but always in the context of solving problems or making adjustments to our design specifications. Tonight I would hear music in the space we had created, would discover whether our theoretical concepts had translated into the kind of musical experience we had envisioned. Professor Martineau had been seated 3 rows behind me, positioned where she would have a clear view of my reactions during the performance. I could feel her attention on me throughout the pre-performance announcements, as if she was studying my behavior for clues about my relationship to the evening's events. Her scrutiny was making me increasingly uncomfortable, partly because I didn't enjoy being observed so intently, and partly because I was beginning to suspect that she was determined to find evidence that would support her conviction that I didn't belong in this professional context. The evening's program had been carefully designed to showcase the Performance Center's range of capabilities. The first piece was a Bach partita performed by the symphony's principal violinist, chosen because Bach's mathematical precision would demonstrate the hall's acoustic clarity, and because solo violin would test the space's ability to support intimate, delicate musical expression. The second piece was a Brahms piano quintet performed by guest artists from the New England Conservatory, selected because the combination of piano and strings would showcase the hall's ability to balance different instrumental timbres while maintaining optimal projection for each individual voice. The final piece of the evening was to be a contemporary composition that had been specifically commissioned for the Performance Center's opening, composed by Dr. Maria Santos, a faculty member from Berklee College of Music who had collaborated with Harmonic Ventures on several educational projects over the past 2 years. Her composition incorporated electronic elements that would be processed through the hall's advanced audio systems, demonstrating the venue's capabilities for multimedia performances that blended acoustic and digital musical elements. What the audience didn't know, and what I had decided to keep confidential until this evening, was that Dr. Santos's composition was based on harmonic progressions and melodic themes that I had developed during my work on the acoustic design for the Performance Center. She had asked me to contribute musical ideas that reflected the emotional and psychological objectives we were trying to achieve through the hall's environmental design, and our collaboration had evolved into a genuine co-composition process, where her traditional compositional training had been enhanced by my unconventional approach to musical structure and psychological impact. More significantly, the evening's program would conclude with a surprise presentation that would reveal my role as the Performance Center's primary benefactor. Ms. Foster and the Symphony's Board of Directors had convinced me that the revelation would be an appropriate way to conclude the gala, demonstrating to potential future donors that investing in classical music innovation could yield results that benefited both the artistic community and the broader public. As the Bach partita began, I had found myself completely absorbed in the musical experience we had created. The violinist's performance was technically flawless, but more importantly, the acoustic environment was allowing subtle interpretive details to emerge with extraordinary clarity. Every bow change, every dynamic variation, every expressive vibrato was being projected to the audience with an intimacy that made the music feel almost conversational, rather than purely performative. But as much as I was enjoying the musical experience, I remained aware of Professor Martineau's continued observation of my reactions. During softer passages, when the audience was completely silent and focused, I could occasionally hear her whispering to Dr. Pemberton, and I suspected that their conversation was about me rather than about the performance. Their behavior was becoming distracting, not just to me but to other audience members who were trying to focus on the music. The Brahms Quintet had been even more revealing of the Performance Center's capabilities. The combination of piano and strings required precise acoustic balancing to ensure that neither the percussive piano sound nor the sustained string tones dominated the musical texture. Our acoustic design had been specifically calibrated to support this kind of chamber music programming, and the performance demonstrated that our theoretical calculations had translated into practical musical benefits. During the brief intermission between the Brahms and the contemporary composition, Professor Martineau had approached my seat with Dr. Pemberton in tow. Her expression suggested that she had decided to confront whatever suspicions she had been developing about my involvement in the evening's events. "Ms. Reyes," she had said, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she had used during my childhood piano lessons, "I've been watching your reactions during tonight's performances, and you seem remarkably familiar with the acoustic properties of this performance hall. You're not just enjoying the music, you're evaluating it as if you understand exactly how the space is supposed to sound." The observation had been accurate, and I had realized that my professional familiarity with the venue's design was probably obvious to anyone who was paying careful attention to my behavior. During each performance, I had been unconsciously monitoring the acoustic balance, the clarity of projection, the effectiveness of our environmental design choices. I was experiencing the music as an audience member, but I was also analyzing it as someone who was responsible for the technical and artistic success of the musical environment. Dr. Pemberton had joined the conversation with his own observation. Helena is right, Ms. Reyes. Your familiarity with this space seems much more comprehensive than would be typical for someone attending their first performance here. You seem to know exactly how the acoustics are supposed to work, almost as if you were involved in designing them. His comment had been perceptive enough to make me realize that continuing to avoid direct answers about my involvement in the project was becoming more difficult than simply acknowledging the truth. Professor Martineau and Dr. Pemberton were both intelligent, observant people who had spent decades analyzing student behavior and detecting inconsistencies in explanations. They were not going to be satisfied with vague responses or diplomatic deflections. You're both very observant, I had said carefully. I have been involved in the technical aspects of this project, which is why I am familiar with how the space is supposed to function acoustically. Professor Martineau had leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpening with interest. Technical aspects? Are you saying you worked on the audio systems for this performance center? Among other things, yes, I had replied, trying to provide enough information to satisfy their curiosity without revealing details that would completely reframe their understanding of my role in the project. But Dr. Pemberton had pressed for more specific information. What kind of technical work? Are you saying that Harmonic Ventures was hired to consult on the acoustic design? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The question had required me to acknowledge a level of involvement that went far beyond simple consultation. Harmonic Ventures designed and implemented the complete audio systems for the Performance Center, including the acoustic enhancements, the recording technologies, and the environmental sound programming. Professor Martineau had been quiet for a moment, clearly processing the implications of this revelation. Ms. Reyes, are you telling me that you were responsible for the acoustic design of this entire performance venue? My company was responsible for the acoustic design, yes, I had said, realizing that there was no longer any point in minimizing my role in the project. We worked in collaboration with the symphony's musical staff and with architectural acoustics specialists, but Harmonic Ventures was the primary contractor for all audio-related technologies and environmental design elements. The information had clearly shocked both Professor Martineau and Dr. Pemberton. They had exchanged glances that suggested they were trying to reconcile this revelation with their previous assumptions about my professional capabilities and my relationship to the classical music establishment. Dr. Pemberton had been the first to respond. That's extraordinary, Ms. Reyes. The acoustic design of this hall is being discussed as one of the most innovative approaches to classical music venue development in recent years. Music critics and acoustic engineers from around the world are going to be studying what you've accomplished here. Professor Martineau had looked even more confused by Dr. Pemberton's praise. Richard, are you saying that this venue represents significant innovation in acoustic design? I thought it was simply a renovation project with some modern audio equipment. Helena, this is much more than modern audio equipment, Dr. Pemberton had explained. The acoustic technologies in this hall are revolutionizing how we think about the relationship between performance space and musical expression. The environmental design allows for recording quality that captures musical details that have never been preserved in live performance settings before. He had continued with growing enthusiasm. The psychological research that informed the design is influencing concert hall development worldwide. Universities are studying the methodologies used here, and major symphony orchestras are inquiring about implementing similar technologies in their own venues. Professor Martineau had stared at me with an expression that suggested she was having difficulty processing this information. The student she remembered as lacking basic musical abilities was being described as someone whose innovations were influencing classical music presentation on an international scale. Ms. Reyes, she had said slowly, when you were my student, you struggled with fundamental concepts like interval recognition and rhythm maintenance. How does that translate into the kind of sophisticated acoustic analysis that would be required for this level of venue design? The question had revealed the heart of Professor Martineau's confusion and discomfort. In her mind, musical ability was a linear progression, from basic technical skills to advanced artistic capabilities. Someone who couldn't master elementary piano exercises shouldn't be capable of revolutionary innovations in acoustic psychology. My success challenged not just her assessment of my childhood potential, but her entire framework for understanding how musical talent developed and expressed itself. Before I could respond to her question, Ms. Foster had returned to our section with an announcement that the second half of the program was about to begin. As we returned to our seats for Dr. Santos's contemporary composition, I had realized that the evening was building toward a revelation that would force Professor Martineau to confront the complete inadequacy of her understanding of my musical abilities. Dr. Santos's composition had been everything I had hoped it would become during our collaborative development process. The piece began with acoustic instruments performing melodic and harmonic material that I had originally created as emotional soundscapes for the hall's environmental design. Gradually, electronic elements were introduced that processed and transformed the acoustic sounds through the Performance Center's advanced audio systems, creating musical textures that would have been impossible in traditional concert settings. The composition demonstrated not just the technical capabilities of our audio innovations, but the artistic possibilities that emerged when acoustic and electronic musical elements were integrated through thoughtful design rather than simple amplification. The audience was hearing music that existed in the intersection between traditional classical performance and cutting-edge digital sound processing. Music that required both conventional instrumental technique and innovative technological application. As the piece progressed, I had become aware that Professor Martineau was no longer just observing my reactions to the performance. She was studying my face during musical passages that I had helped create, trying to determine whether I was simply enjoying music that others had composed, or whether I was experiencing something more personal and direct. Her scrutiny was making me increasingly self-conscious, but it was also making me realize that the evening's final revelation was going to be even more impactful than I had anticipated. When Dr. Santos's composition concluded to enthusiastic applause, Ms. Foster had taken the stage for the evening's final presentation. She had thanked the guests for their support of the Berkshire Performance Center, had acknowledged the musicians and technical staff who had made the evening possible, and had praised the collaborative relationships that had enabled the symphony to create such an innovative performance venue. Tonight's performances have demonstrated the extraordinary artistic possibilities that emerge when classical music traditions are enhanced by cutting-edge technological innovation, Ms. Foster had said, her voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a development professional who genuinely believed in her organization's mission. The Berkshire Performance Center represents a new model for classical music presentation, one that honors traditional artistry while embracing the tools and techniques that will allow classical music to reach new audiences and achieve new forms of expression. She had continued, "This project would not have been possible without the vision and generosity of donors who understand that innovation requires risk, that artistic excellence requires investment, and that the future of classical music depends on our willingness to explore new possibilities while preserving the traditions that have made this art form enduringly powerful." Professor Martineau had been listening to. She had no reason to anticipate that the evening's final announcement would personally involve her, or relate to our earlier conversation about my musical background. "Tonight," Ms. Foster had continued, "we have the privilege of publicly thanking the individual whose extraordinary generosity made the final phase of this project possible. The Berkshire Performance Center's advanced acoustic systems, its cutting-edge recording technologies, and its innovative environmental design elements exist because one person believed that classical music deserved the most sophisticated tools available for artistic expression and audience engagement." She had paused for dramatic effect, and I had felt my heart rate accelerate as I prepared for the moment that would completely reframe Professor Martineau's understanding of my relationship to the classical music establishment. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Ms. Sophia Reyes, founder and artistic director of Harmonic Ventures, for her $8.5 million gift that made the Berkshire Performance Center possible. The applause that had followed Ms. Foster's announcement had been immediate and sustained, but I had been focused entirely on Professor Martineau's reaction to the revelation. I had watched her face transform through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, confusion, and then something that looked almost like anger, as if my success was somehow a personal affront to her professional expertise. As the applause had continued and guests had turned to acknowledge my presence, Professor Martineau had remained seated, staring at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. The woman she remembered as lacking basic musical talent had just been revealed as someone whose financial success had enabled her to single-handedly fund a world-class performance venue, whose artistic vision had shaped one of the most innovative acoustic environments in North America, whose professional expertise was being celebrated by some of the most respected musicians in the classical music establishment. Dr. Pemberton had been among the first to recover from his surprise, standing to join the applause and then approaching me with an expression of genuine admiration and respect. "Sophia, this is extraordinary. I had no idea that you were the benefactor who made this project possible. Your generosity has created something that will serve the classical music community for generations." Professor Martineau had remained in her seat, but I could see her struggling to process the implications of what she had just learned. In her mind, I had been a failed piano student who had abandoned classical music because I lacked the talent necessary for serious study. Now she was learning that I had not only continued with music but had achieved a level of success that allowed me to influence classical music programming on a scale that she could never have imagined. As the applause had finally subsided and guests had begun to move toward the reception area for post-performance refreshments, Professor Martineau had approached me with an expression that combined confusion, embarrassment, and what looked suspiciously like resentment. "Ms. Reyes," she had said, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of tension, "I have to admit that I'm having some difficulty understanding tonight's revelations. When you were my student, you showed no indication of the kind of musical ability that would predict this level of professional success." The comment had been structured as an observation, but it had carried an unmistakable challenge. Professor Martineau was not simply expressing surprise about my career development, she was questioning the validity of my musical accomplishments, implying that my success must be based on something other than genuine musical ability. Dr. Morrison, who had been standing nearby during this exchange, had stepped forward with an expression of protective concern. "Helena, I think you may be underestimating what musical ability looks like when it develops outside traditional conservatory frameworks. Sophia's understanding of music is extraordinarily sophisticated. It's just expressed through different channels than conventional performance training." But Professor Martineau had seemed determined to maintain her position despite the growing evidence that her colleagues disagreed with her assessment. "Elizabeth, I'm not questioning Ms. Reyes's business acumen or her ability to apply technology to musical presentation. I'm simply observing that during our 3 years of study together, she demonstrated consistent difficulty with basic musical concepts that are fundamental to serious musical education." Maestro Chen had joined our conversation at this point, having overheard Professor Martineau's comments while saying goodbye to other guests. His expression suggested that he was beginning to understand that this was more than a simple reunion between former teacher and student. "Helena," he had said carefully, "I'm curious about your assessment of Sophia's musical abilities, because my experience working with her has been quite different. Her analytical approach to musical structure has influenced how our musicians think about interpretive possibilities, and her compositions for our educational programs have demonstrated sophisticated understanding of harmonic development and emotional expression." Professor Martineau had looked around our small group, clearly realizing that she was once again outnumbered in her criticism of my musical competence, but instead of reconsidering her position, she had seemed to become more entrenched in her conviction that there must be some explanation for the disconnect between her memories of my childhood limitations and the professional success that her colleagues were describing. "Perhaps," she had said with careful precision, "Ms. Reyes has found ways to compensate for her musical limitations through technological innovation and business strategy. Not everyone who works in music-related fields requires traditional musical talent. There are many ways to contribute to musical organizations without possessing genuine artistic ability." The comment had been devastatingly dismissive, reducing my entire professional accomplishment to technological compensation for artistic inadequacy. Professor Martineau was acknowledging my success while simultaneously denying that it represented genuine musical achievement. In her framework, my work was adjacent to music rather than musical itself, valuable perhaps as business innovation but irrelevant to questions of artistic merit. Dr. Morrison had looked genuinely shocked by the condescension in Professor Martineau's response. "Helena, I think you're seriously misunderstanding the nature and significance of Sophia's work. She's not compensating for musical limitations, she's expanding our understanding of what musical ability can accomplish." But before Professor Martineau could respond, I had decided that this conversation needed to move beyond diplomatic disagreement. She was not simply expressing alternative opinions about musical education. She was actively undermining my professional credibility, in front of colleagues whose respect and collaboration were essential to my continued work within the classical music community. Professor Martineau, I had said, my voice remaining calm but becoming more direct. I think we need to clarify something important. The musical abilities you believe I lack are actually the foundation for everything I've accomplished professionally. My approach to understanding music may be different from what you taught at Whitmore, but it's not inferior to traditional conservatory training. It's simply designed to achieve different objectives. She had looked skeptical, as if challenging me to prove claims that she considered obviously false. Ms. Reyes, musical ability is not subjective. There are established standards for evaluating technical competence, theoretical knowledge, and interpretive sophistication. These standards exist because they reflect centuries of musical tradition and pedagogical development. I agree that traditional standards are important, I had replied, but musical intelligence encompasses much more than technical execution. Pattern recognition, harmonic analysis, structural composition, acoustic psychology. These are all forms of musical knowledge that may not manifest through conventional lesson plans, but that represent genuine musical understanding. Maestro Chen had nodded approvingly. Sophia is absolutely correct. Some of our most innovative musicians are those who bring unconventional perspectives to classical traditions. Her work with us has demonstrated that musical intelligence can express itself through many different channels, not all of which are captured by traditional educational assessments. Professor Martineau had been quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with the implications of our disagreement. Finally, she had looked directly at me with an expression that combined challenge and genuine curiosity. Ms. Reyes, if you believe that your musical understanding is as sophisticated as these colleagues suggest, would you be willing to demonstrate that understanding in a more traditional context? Would you be willing to actually perform music rather than simply talking about musical theory and business applications? The challenge had been unmistakable, and I had realized that Professor Martineau was offering me an opportunity to prove my musical abilities in terms that she would be forced to acknowledge. She was essentially daring me to demonstrate that my unconventional approach to musical education had produced results that could compete with traditional conservatory training. Dr. Morrison had looked concerned about where this conversation was heading. Helena, I'm not sure that's appropriate. Sophia is here tonight as the benefactor and artistic consultant for this project, not as a performer. Asking her to audition for your approval seems unnecessarily confrontational. But I had found myself intrigued by Professor Martineau's challenge, partly because I was confident in my musical abilities, and partly because I realized that this might be the only way to finally resolve the fundamental disagreement between us about the nature and value of musical talent. Actually, Dr. Morrison, I think Professor Martineau's suggestion is reasonable, I had said. If my musical abilities are as limited as she remembers, then demonstrating those limitations publicly would be educational for everyone involved. And if my abilities have developed beyond her expectations, then demonstrating that development would also be valuable. Professor Martineau had looked surprised that I was willing to accept her challenge, and I had seen a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, as if she was suddenly questioning the wisdom of pushing this confrontation to its logical conclusion. Miss Foster, who had been listening to our exchange with growing fascination, had stepped forward with a suggestion that would transform Professor Martineau's challenge into something much more significant than a simple demonstration of musical competence. Actually, Miss Foster had said, if Ms. Reyes is willing to perform, this could be a wonderful opportunity to demonstrate the Performance Center's capabilities with someone who understands the technical systems intimately. We could arrange for a brief performance that would showcase both Sophia's musical abilities and the acoustic innovations she helped create. Maestro Chen had looked intrigued by this possibility. That's a fascinating idea, Caroline. Having the venue's primary designer perform in the space would provide unique insights into how the acoustic innovations translate into actual musical expression. I had realized that what had started as Professor Martineau's challenge to my musical competence was evolving into something much more comprehensive, an opportunity to demonstrate not just my ability to perform music, but my understanding of how musical performance could be enhanced through the kind of technological innovation that Professor Martineau had dismissed as compensation for artistic inadequacy. What did you have in mind? I had asked Ms. Foster, genuinely curious about how this impromptu performance might be structured. Well, she had said, clearly thinking through the logistics as she spoke, the Performance Center's piano is still on stage from Dr. Santos's composition, and our recording systems are still active. If you were willing to perform something relatively brief, we could capture it through our audio systems and provide immediate playback that would demonstrate the recording capabilities while showcasing your musical interpretation. Professor Martineau had looked increasingly uncomfortable with how this situation was developing. What had begun as her challenge to my musical abilities was turning into a formal performance opportunity that would be recorded and potentially preserved as part of the Performance Center's documentation. If my performance was successful, it would provide permanent evidence that her assessment of my musical limitations had been completely incorrect. Ms. Reyes, she had said carefully, I hope you understand that I wasn't trying to pressure you into performing publicly. I was simply expressing curiosity about how your musical understanding might translate into actual performance capabilities. The attempt to backtrack had been transparent, and I had realized that Professor Martineau was beginning to understand that her challenge might produce results that would be professionally embarrassing for her, rather than vindicating her assessment of my abilities. Professor Martineau, I had said, I appreciate your concern, but I'm genuinely interested in this opportunity. It's been years since I've performed in a formal classical setting, and I'm curious to experience how the acoustic environment we've created affects musical expression from a performer's perspective. Dr. Morrison had looked excited by the possibility. Sophia, this could be extraordinary. You'll be able to hear exactly how the hall responds to musical interpretation, and we'll be able to document your performance for future reference and analysis. Maestro Chen had been nodding approvingly, and from a purely musical perspective, having someone with your unconventional background perform in this space will provide insights that we wouldn't get from traditional conservatory-trained musicians. Your approach to musical interpretation might reveal possibilities in the acoustic design that we haven't discovered yet. As the small group of remaining guests had gathered around the piano on the Performance Center's stage, I had felt a complex mixture of excitement and nervousness that I hadn't experienced since my childhood recitals at Whitmore. The difference was that tonight I was performing as a professional rather than as a student, as someone whose musical abilities were being evaluated by colleagues who respected my work, rather than by an instructor who was cataloging my deficiencies. Professor Martineau had positioned herself in the front row of seats, clearly determined to observe my performance with the same analytical scrutiny she had applied to my childhood lessons. Her expression suggested that she was still expecting to witness confirmation of her assessment, that my musical understanding was superficial, despite my professional success in music-related business applications. I had approached the piano with the kind of calm focus that came from years of performing in professional contexts, even if those contexts had been recording studios and corporate presentations rather than classical concert settings. The instrument was a Steinway Model D Concert Grand, the same piano that had been used for Dr. Santos's composition earlier in the evening. As I adjusted the bench and tested the keyboard's response, I had been struck by the realization that this was the finest piano I had ever played, an instrument whose capabilities far exceeded anything I had access to during my childhood studies. What would you like to perform? Miss Foster had asked, settling into a seat near the recording console where she could monitor the audio capture systems. I had considered several possibilities: pieces that would demonstrate traditional technical competence, compositions that would showcase interpretive sophistication, or contemporary works that would highlight my unconventional approach to musical structure. Finally, I had decided on a choice that would address Professor Martineau's challenge directly, while revealing the extent to which my musical abilities had developed beyond her expectations. I'm going to perform the Bach invention that I played during my final recital at Whitmore 20 years ago, I had announced, but I'm going to perform it the way I heard it then, rather than the way I was taught to play it. The choice had clearly surprised Professor Martineau, who had straightened in her seat with an expression of sharp attention. She remembered that recital, and my performance of that particular Bach invention. She remembered her criticism of my interpretive choices and her assessment that my inability to follow the written score faithfully demonstrated fundamental musical inadequacy. Dr. Morrison had looked intrigued by this decision. That's a wonderful choice, Sophia. Bach's inventions are perfect for demonstrating both technical precision and interpretive sophistication. And performing a piece with personal history will add emotional depth to the musical expression. Maestro Chen had nodded approvingly. And Bach's mathematical structures will showcase the hall's acoustic clarity beautifully. The contrapuntal voice leading should demonstrate how our audio systems preserve individual melodic lines while maintaining harmonic blend. As I had prepared to begin the performance, I had found myself thinking about the 11-year-old girl who had sat at a similar piano bench 20 years earlier, trying desperately to please a teacher who had already decided that her musical instincts were wrong. That child had understood the emotional architecture of Bach's composition, but had been unable to communicate that understanding through the rigid interpretive framework that Professor Martineau had demanded. Tonight I was going to perform the same piece with the freedom to express everything I had heard in the music but had been forbidden to reveal. The opening measures of the Bach invention had emerged from the Steinway with a clarity and richness that exceeded even my expectations for the performance center's acoustic capabilities. Every note was distinct but connected, every phrase was shaped but natural, every harmonic progression was clear but expressive. I had been simultaneously performing the music and analyzing the acoustic environment, experiencing the composition as both musician and audio engineer. But more importantly, I had been interpreting the invention according to my own musical understanding, rather than according to Professor Martineau's prescriptive approach to Bach performance. Where she had demanded metronomic regularity, I was using subtle tempo variations to highlight the mathematical relationships between melodic voices. Where she had insisted on literal dynamic markings, I was shaping phrases to reveal the emotional content that Bach had embedded in his apparently abstract musical structures. As the performance had progressed, I had become aware that the acoustic environment was allowing interpretive details to emerge with extraordinary clarity. Every musical choice I was making, every slight hesitation before a cadence, every gentle emphasis on a returning melodic fragment, every dynamic swell that revealed harmonic tension was being projected to my small audience with the kind of intimacy that made musical interpretation feel like musical conversation. Professor Martineau had been leaning forward in her seat, her expression shifting from skeptical attention to something that looked almost like confusion. The performance she was hearing bore no resemblance to the mechanical, rhythm-challenged playing she remembered from my childhood lessons. The musical interpretation I was demonstrating revealed sophisticated understanding of Bach's compositional techniques, advanced technical control of the piano's expressive capabilities, and the kind of artistic maturity that typically required decades of serious musical study. When I had concluded the invention, the silence in the performance hall had stretched for several moments before Ms. Foster had initiated applause that was immediately joined by Dr. Morrison, Maestro Chen, and the other guests who had remained for this impromptu demonstration. But Professor Martineau had remained silent, staring at the piano as if trying to process what she had just witnessed. Dr. Morrison had been the first to speak. "Sophia, that was absolutely beautiful. Your interpretation revealed layers in that Bach invention that I've never heard before, even in performances by world-class classical pianists. The way you shaped the contrapuntal voices to highlight their mathematical relationships while maintaining emotional expressiveness that was genuinely artistic." Maestro Chen had nodded enthusiastically. "And the acoustic environment captured every detail of your interpretation perfectly. The hall's design allowed your musical choices to project with the kind of clarity that makes the difference between hearing notes and hearing music." Miss Foster had been monitoring the recording systems during my performance, and her expression suggested that the technical results had been as successful as the artistic ones. "The audio capture is extraordinary," she had announced. Every nuance of Sophia's interpretation was preserved with concert-quality clarity. This recording could be used for educational purposes, for promotional materials, or for documentation of the hall's capabilities. But Professor Martineau had remained silent, and I had realized that my performance had created a cognitive dissonance that she was struggling to resolve. The musical abilities she had just witnessed directly contradicted 20 years of conviction that I lacked fundamental musical talent. Either her original assessment had been completely wrong, or there was some other explanation for the discrepancy between my childhood limitations and my current capabilities. Finally, she had spoken, her voice quiet but carrying the same analytical tone she had used during my childhood lessons. Ms. Reyes, I have to admit that your performance was quite different from what I remembered of your playing abilities. Your technical control was adequate, and your interpretive choices were certainly distinctive. The comment had been structured as a concession, but it had carried undertones that suggested Professor Martineau was still reluctant to acknowledge that her original assessment had been fundamentally flawed. By describing my technique as adequate and my interpretation as distinctive, she was providing minimal praise while avoiding any admission that my musical abilities were actually sophisticated. Dr. Morrison had looked surprised by the carefully neutral tone of Professor Martineau's response. Helena, I think you're being unnecessarily reserved in your assessment. Sophia's performance demonstrated advanced musical understanding and professional-level technical competence. Her interpretation of that Bach invention was genuinely artistic. But Professor Martineau had seemed determined to maintain some version of her original position, despite the evidence that contradicted it. Elizabeth, I'm not saying that Ms. Reyes hasn't developed some level of musical competence over the years. I'm simply observing that her current abilities don't necessarily invalidate my assessment of her childhood potential. Some people are late bloomers, and some people find ways to compensate for early limitations through determined practice. The explanation had been carefully constructed to acknowledge my current success while preserving Professor Martineau's conviction that her original judgment had been accurate. In her revised narrative, I had been correctly assessed as lacking musical talent, but I had somehow overcome those limitations through persistence and compensation, rather than through the development of genuine artistic ability. Maestro Chen had looked increasingly uncomfortable with Professor Martineau's continued criticism. Helena, I think you may be missing something important about musical development. Sophia's performance tonight didn't demonstrate compensation for limitations. It demonstrated sophisticated musical intelligence that was probably present during her childhood, but wasn't recognized through traditional assessment methods. He had continued with growing conviction. The interpretive maturity she displayed tonight, the structural understanding of Bach's compositional techniques, the technical control required for that level of expressive detail. These capabilities don't develop overnight. They represent years of serious musical study and practice, even if that study occurred outside conventional conservatory frameworks. Professor Martineau had been quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with the implications of Maestro Chen's analysis. Finally, she had looked directly at me with an expression that combined challenge and what might have been genuine curiosity. Ms. Reyes, help me understand something. If you possess the musical abilities that tonight's performance suggests, why were you unable to demonstrate those abilities during our lessons at Whitmore? Why did you consistently struggle with basic exercises and theoretical concepts that should have been simple for someone with your apparent understanding of musical structure? The question had been fair, and I had realized that Professor Martineau deserved an honest explanation of why my musical abilities had been invisible to her traditional assessment methods. The answer would require me to acknowledge not just the limitations of her teaching approach, but the extent to which I had continued my musical education independently after leaving Whitmore. Professor Martineau, I had said carefully, the musical abilities you witnessed tonight developed because I was finally free to learn music in ways that matched how my mind processes musical information. During our lessons, I was trying to force my musical understanding into frameworks that felt artificial and disconnected from actual musical expression. I had continued. Your teaching methods emphasized technical exercises and theoretical analysis that made sense intellectually, but didn't help me access the emotional and structural relationships that made music meaningful to me. When I left Whitmore, I didn't stop studying music. I started studying it in ways that aligned with my natural learning processes. Professor Martineau had looked skeptical. Ms. Reyes, musical education exists because certain concepts and techniques are fundamental to serious musical development. You can't simply ignore traditional training methods because they feel artificial or uncomfortable. I didn't ignore traditional concepts, I had replied. I learned them through different approaches. Instead of practicing scales to develop technical facility, I learned harmonic relationships by analyzing how different composers used them to create emotional effects. Instead of memorizing theoretical rules about voice leading, I learned contrapuntal techniques by improvising Bach-style inventions until I understood how the mathematical relationships created musical logic. Dr. Morrison had been nodding as I spoke. That's exactly the kind of intuitive learning that produces the most profound musical understanding. Sophia approached musical education as exploration rather than instruction, which allowed her to develop genuine musical insight rather than just technical competence. But Professor Martineau had still seemed resistant to accepting that alternative approaches to musical education could produce results that equaled or exceeded traditional conservatory training. Ms. Reyes, musical intuition is valuable, but it must be grounded in solid technical foundation and theoretical knowledge. Without proper formal training, musical instincts can lead to amateur mistakes and interpretive choices that seem sophisticated but actually reveal fundamental misunderstandings. That was when I had decided that this conversation required more than verbal explanation. Professor Martineau was not going to be convinced by descriptions of alternative learning methods or testimonials from colleagues about my musical competence. She needed evidence that would force her to confront the inadequacy of her assessment frameworks, and the possibility that musical talent could express itself through pathways that her traditional training had never taught her to recognize. Professor Martineau, I had said, would you be willing to test that theory? Would you be willing to present me with a musical challenge that would reveal whether my unconventional education has produced genuine musical understanding, or simply the illusion of competence? The offer had clearly surprised her, and I had seen uncertainty flicker across her face as she realized that I was essentially inviting her to design a musical test that would definitively resolve our disagreement about my abilities. Dr. Pemberton, who had been listening to our conversation with growing interest, had stepped forward with a suggestion that would make Professor Martineau's challenge even more comprehensive than a simple performance evaluation. Helena, he had said, since Ms. Reyes is willing to be evaluated, why don't you test the full range of musical abilities that you believe are essential for serious musical competence? Technical execution, theoretical analysis, improvisational capabilities, and interpretive sophistication. He had continued with the kind of academic enthusiasm that suggested he was genuinely curious about the outcome of such an evaluation. You could design a series of musical challenges that would reveal whether Sophia's unconventional training has produced results that meet the standards you would expect from traditional conservatory education. Ms. Foster had looked excited by this possibility. And we could document the entire evaluation through our recording systems, creating a comprehensive record of how innovative musical education compares to traditional approaches. This could be valuable for educational research and curriculum development. I had realized that what had started as Professor Martineau's skeptical challenge to my musical competence was evolving into something much more significant, a formal assessment that would be preserved as documentation of the effectiveness of unconventional approaches to musical education. If I succeeded in meeting her challenges, the recording would provide permanent evidence that alternative paths to musical understanding could produce results that equaled traditional conservatory training. Professor Martineau had been quiet for several moments, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of designing such a comprehensive evaluation. If my performance met her standards, she would be forced to acknowledge that her original assessment had been fundamentally flawed, and that her entire framework for evaluating musical talent needed revision. But if my performance revealed limitations or deficiencies, she would have definitive proof that her skepticism about unconventional musical education was justified. Very well, she had said finally, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she had used when designing challenging assignments for her most advanced students. Ms. Reyes, if you're genuinely interested in demonstrating the effectiveness of your alternative musical education, I'll design an evaluation that tests the full range of capabilities that I consider essential for serious musical competence. She had paused to consider the specific challenges she wanted to include, then had continued with growing confidence. First, I want you to perform a technically demanding piece that will demonstrate your current level of instrumental facility. Second, I want you to analyze a complex composition in real time, explaining the theoretical foundations that support the composer's structural and harmonic choices. Third, I want you to improvise a musical response to a piece you've never heard before, demonstrating your ability to process musical information spontaneously. Dr. Morrison had looked concerned about the scope of Professor Martineau's proposed evaluation. Helena, that's quite an extensive assessment. Are you sure this is appropriate for a social gathering? But I had found myself genuinely excited by the comprehensiveness of Professor Martineau's challenge. Actually, Dr. Morrison, I think Professor Martineau's evaluation design is excellent. Those three areas, technical execution, theoretical analysis, and improvisational response represent exactly the kinds of musical abilities that matter most in professional contexts. Maestro Chen had been nodding approvingly. And testing those capabilities in this acoustic environment will provide insights into how the Performance Center enhances different types of musical expression. This could be genuinely valuable documentation of both musical education and acoustic innovation. Miss Foster had been practically vibrating with excitement about the research possibilities. We could structure this as a formal case study, documenting how unconventional musical education produces results that can be measured against traditional assessment criteria. The recording could be used for educational conferences, curriculum development research, even promotional materials for the Performance Center. As the remaining guests had gathered around the piano area to witness Professor Martineau's comprehensive evaluation of my musical abilities, I had felt the same kind of focused calm that I experienced during important business presentations or technical demonstrations. I was confident in my musical capabilities, but I was also aware that this evaluation would determine not just Professor Martineau's assessment of my competence, but the entire trajectory of my relationship with the classical music establishment that had rejected me as a child. Professor Martineau had positioned herself at the piano bench, clearly intending to collaborate in designing the specific challenges rather than simply observing my responses. Her expression suggested that she was approaching this evaluation with the same analytical rigor she brought to doctoral examinations at Whitmore, determined to create tests that would reveal genuine musical understanding rather than superficial competence. For your technical demonstration, she had announced, I want you to perform the first movement of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. This piece requires advanced technique, sophisticated interpretive understanding, and the ability to maintain musical coherence across complex structural transitions. The choice had been both challenging and appropriate. Chopin's first ballade was technically demanding enough to test the limits of my instrumental capabilities, but it was also musically complex enough to require genuine artistic understanding rather than simple technical execution. Professor Martineau had selected a piece that would reveal whether my piano technique had developed to professional levels and whether my interpretive abilities could handle one of the most sophisticated compositions in the standard repertoire. For your theoretical analysis, she had continued, I want you to examine the score of a contemporary composition that you've never encountered before, and explain in real time how the composer has used harmonic progressions, rhythmic patterns, and structural relationships to achieve specific artistic objectives. This challenge would test not just my knowledge of music theory, but my ability to apply that knowledge to unfamiliar material under pressure. Professor Martineau was essentially asking me to demonstrate that my unconventional musical education had produced the kind of analytical sophistication that would typically require years of formal academic study. And for your improvisational response, she had concluded, I want you to create a musical dialogue with Dr. Morrison's flute playing. She'll perform a melodic theme, and you'll need to respond with harmonic support, contrapuntal lines, and developmental variations that demonstrate your ability to process musical information spontaneously and create coherent artistic responses in real time. The three-part evaluation that Professor Martineau had designed was more comprehensive than most doctoral qualifying examinations in classical music performance. She was testing not just my ability to play piano competently, but my capacity to function as a complete musician who could perform, analyze, and create music at professional levels. Dr. Morrison had looked impressed by the scope of the evaluation. Helena, you've designed a truly comprehensive assessment. If Sophia can meet these challenges successfully, it will provide definitive evidence of her musical competence regardless of her educational background. But Professor Martineau had seemed determined to maintain her skepticism, despite the fairness of her own evaluation design. Elizabeth, I've designed these challenges specifically to test the kinds of musical abilities that I believe are essential for serious musical competence. If Ms. Reyes has genuinely developed those abilities through unconventional methods, then her performance will demonstrate that clearly. She had paused, then had added with unmistakable challenge in her voice, but if her musical understanding is as superficial as I suspect it may be, then these challenges will reveal the limitations that have been disguised by technological innovation and business success. The comment had revealed that Professor Martineau was still expecting my evaluation to confirm her original assessment of my musical limitations. Despite the evidence she had already witnessed tonight, my successful acoustic design work, my sophisticated performance of the Bach invention, my obvious familiarity with advanced musical concepts, she remained convinced that deeper testing would reveal fundamental deficiencies in my musical understanding. I had realized that Professor Martineau's investment in proving my musical inadequacy went beyond simple professional disagreement. My success challenged not just her assessment of my childhood potential, but her entire identity, as someone whose expertise allowed her to recognize and develop genuine musical talent. If she had been completely wrong about my abilities, it raised uncomfortable questions about her competence as an educator and her authority as an evaluator of musical potential. "Professor Martineau," I had said, approaching the piano bench with calm confidence, "I'm ready to begin whenever you are. Should I start with the Chopin Ballade?" She had nodded, settling into a chair positioned where she could observe both my technical execution and my interpretive choices. Her expression suggested that she was preparing to witness the kind of detailed analysis she had applied to countless student performances over the years, looking for signs of musical limitation that would validate her assessment of my capabilities. As I had prepared to perform the opening measures of Chopin's Ballade No. 1, I had found myself thinking about the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. 20 years ago, I had been a confused and devastated child whose love of music had been systematically dismantled by an instructor who couldn't recognize musical intelligence when it expressed itself through unconventional channels. Tonight, I was about to demonstrate that musical talent, like all forms of human potential, could develop and flourish when given appropriate support and freedom to grow according to its own natural patterns. The opening melody of the Chopin Ballade had emerged from the Steinway with the kind of singing tone that revealed both the instrument's extraordinary capabilities and the acoustic environment's ability to support expressive musical performance. As I had moved through the piece's complex technical passages, I had been simultaneously focused on musical expression and aware of how the performance center's design was enhancing every aspect of my playing. But more importantly, I had been performing the Chopin with complete musical freedom, interpreting the composition according to my own understanding of its emotional architecture, rather than according to any prescribed approach to Romantic period performance practice. Every phrase was shaped by my personal response to Chopin's musical ideas. Every dynamic choice reflected my analysis of how the composer had used piano technique to create specific expressive effects. As the ballade had progressed through its various sections, I had become aware that Professor Martineau's expression was shifting from skeptical attention to something that looked increasingly like amazement. The technical facility I was demonstrating exceeded anything she had witnessed during my childhood lessons. But more significantly, the musical interpretation I was providing revealed sophisticated understanding of Chopin's compositional techniques and artistic objectives. When I had concluded the ballad to sustained applause from the small audience that had gathered to witness Professor Martineau's evaluation, she had remained silent for several moments, clearly struggling to process what she had just experienced. Dr. Morrison had been the first to respond, her voice carrying genuine enthusiasm and professional respect. "Sophia, that was extraordinary. Your performance demonstrated not just advanced technical competence, but profound musical understanding. The way you shaped Chopin's melodic lines to reveal their emotional content while maintaining structural coherence, that was genuinely artistic interpretation." Maestro Chen had nodded emphatically. "And the acoustic environment captured every detail of your performance perfectly. The hall's design allowed your interpretive choices to project with remarkable clarity and immediacy." Ms. Foster had been monitoring the recording systems throughout my performance, and her expression suggested that the technical documentation had been as successful as the artistic presentation. "The audio capture is remarkable," she had announced. Every nuance of Sophia's interpretation was preserved with studio-quality clarity. But Professor Martineau had remained quiet, and I had realized that my successful performance of the Chopin Ballade had created an even deeper cognitive challenge for her than my earlier Bach interpretation had. She could no longer dismiss my musical abilities as adequate or distinctive. She was being forced to acknowledge that I was capable of genuinely sophisticated classical music performance. Finally, she had spoken, her voice carrying less certainty than it had earlier in the evening. "Ms. Reyes, your performance of the Chopin was technically competent and interpretively interesting. You've clearly developed your instrumental abilities significantly since our lessons at Whitmore." The response had been more positive than her reaction to the Bach invention, but it had still carried undertones of reluctance to fully acknowledge the sophistication of my musical understanding. Professor Martineau was providing measured praise while avoiding any admission that her original assessment had been fundamentally wrong. "Are you ready for the theoretical analysis challenge?" she had asked, clearly determined to continue with the evaluation despite her obvious discomfort with the results she was witnessing. I had nodded, genuinely curious about what contemporary composition she would choose for my analysis, and confident in my ability to demonstrate theoretical knowledge that had been developed through practical application rather than academic study. Professor Martineau had retrieved her tablet from her purse and had located a score that she had apparently selected specifically for this evaluation. "I want you to analyze this contemporary piece by composer Jennifer Higdon, a work that combines traditional harmonic structures with innovative rhythmic patterns and unconventional instrumental techniques." She had displayed the score on her tablet and had positioned it where I could study the notation while providing real-time analysis for our small audience. The composition was indeed complex, incorporating elements that would challenge both theoretical knowledge and practical understanding of how contemporary classical music achieved its artistic effects. As I had begun examining the score, I had immediately recognized that this was exactly the kind of musical analysis that I performed regularly in my professional work with Harmonic Ventures. Contemporary classical compositions required the same kind of structural understanding and psychological insight that we applied when creating music for therapeutic and educational applications. "This is fascinating," I had begun, pointing to specific sections of the score while explaining my analysis to the group. Higdon is using traditional tonal centers as anchoring points for harmonic progressions that explore chromatic relationships without abandoning tonal logic entirely. The result is music that sounds innovative and contemporary but remains emotionally accessible because it maintains connection to harmonic patterns that listeners can follow intuitively. I had continued through the composition, explaining how the rhythmic complexity created forward momentum that enhanced rather than competed with the melodic development, how the instrumental writing exploited each instrument's technical capabilities while serving the overall compositional structure, how the dynamic markings created dramatic tension that supported the piece's emotional narrative. Professor Martineau had listened to my analysis with growing amazement, occasionally asking follow-up questions that tested the depth of my theoretical knowledge. Each question had revealed that my understanding of contemporary composition techniques was not just comprehensive, but practically grounded in ways that purely academic study rarely achieved. Dr. Pemberton had been taking notes during my analysis, clearly impressed by the sophistication of my theoretical knowledge and my ability to explain complex musical concepts in accessible language. "Sophia, your analysis demonstrates remarkable understanding of contemporary composition techniques. Your explanations reveal both theoretical sophistication and practical insight into how these musical elements achieve their artistic objectives." When I had completed my analysis of the Higdon composition, Professor Martineau had been quiet for a long moment before announcing the final challenge. "Ms. Reyes, are you ready for the improvisational collaboration with Dr. Morrison?" I had nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and anticipation about this final test. Improvisation was one of my strongest musical abilities, but it was also the skill that Professor Martineau had most consistently criticized during my childhood lessons. She had always insisted that improvisation was evidence of inability to follow written music properly, that students who preferred to create their own musical ideas were avoiding the discipline required for serious musical study. Dr. Morrison had approached the piano with her flute, clearly excited about the opportunity to collaborate in this spontaneous musical creation. "Sophia, I'm going to begin with a simple melodic theme, and I'd like you to respond with whatever harmonic and rhythmic support feels appropriate. From there, we can develop the musical conversation organically." As Dr. Morrison had begun playing a beautiful, lyrical melody in a major key, I had immediately heard harmonic possibilities that would enhance and develop her musical ideas. My piano response had begun with simple accompaniment that supported her melodic line, but as the improvisation had continued, I had introduced harmonic variations, rhythmic counterpoint, and developmental techniques that transformed our duet into a sophisticated musical conversation. The Performance Center's acoustic design had been perfect for this kind of intimate musical collaboration, allowing both the flute's delicate melodic lines and the piano's harmonic support to project with equal clarity while blending into a coherent musical texture. As our improvisation had developed, I had found myself making musical choices that revealed not just my technical capabilities, but my understanding of how two musical voices could interact to create artistic effects that neither instrument could achieve independently. Professor Martineau had been leaning forward in her seat, clearly focused on analyzing every aspect of our improvisational collaboration. Her expression suggested that she was witnessing musical capabilities that exceeded her expectations, not just for my individual abilities, but for the kind of sophisticated musical interaction that typically required years of ensemble training. When Dr. Morrison and I had concluded our improvisation to enthusiastic applause from our small audience, Professor Martineau had remained silent for what felt like several minutes. Finally, she had stood up and had approached the piano with an expression that combined professional respect with what looked like genuine personal confusion. "Ms. Reyes," she had said, her voice quiet but carrying unmistakable sincerity, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond tonight's conversation. Your performance tonight has demonstrated musical abilities that I not only failed to recognize during our lessons, but that I actively discouraged through my assessment methods." She had paused, clearly struggling with the implications of what she was acknowledging, then had continued. "The technical competence, theoretical knowledge, and artistic sophistication you've displayed tonight represent exactly the kind of musical intelligence that I've spent my career trying to identify and develop in my students. The fact that I was unable to recognize those capabilities in you suggests that my evaluation methods may be far more limited than I've been willing to admit." The apology had been more comprehensive and more honest than I had expected, and I had realized that Professor Martineau was not just acknowledging her mistake about my individual abilities, but questioning her entire approach to musical education and talent assessment. Dr. Morrison had looked visibly moved by Professor Martineau's acknowledgement. "Helena, that's a remarkably generous admission. It takes genuine professional integrity to acknowledge when our assessment methods have failed to recognize the very qualities we're trying to cultivate." Maestro Chen had nodded approvingly, and Helena's willingness to question her own evaluation frameworks demonstrates exactly the kind of intellectual honesty that advances our understanding of how musical talent develops and expresses itself. Professor Martineau had looked around our small group, then had focused her attention back on me with an expression of genuine curiosity. "Ms. Reyes, help me understand something important. How did you develop the musical abilities that you've demonstrated tonight? What kind of study and practice produced results that apparently exceeded what traditional conservatory training achieved for most of my other students?" The question had been exactly what I had been hoping to hear from Professor Martineau, evidence that she was genuinely interested in understanding alternative approaches to musical education, rather than simply defending her original assessment methods. "Professor Martineau," I had said, "the musical abilities you witnessed tonight developed because I was finally free to learn music according to my own natural learning processes rather than according to predetermined educational frameworks. When I left Whitmore, I didn't stop studying music. I started studying it in ways that matched how my mind processes musical information." I had continued, explaining the educational journey that had taken me from devastated 11-year-old to successful musical professional. Instead of practicing technical exercises that felt disconnected from musical expression, I learned technique by analyzing how great performers used piano mechanics to achieve specific artistic effects. Instead of memorizing theoretical rules about harmony and voice leading, I learned compositional principles by experimenting with creating music that achieved emotional objectives that mattered to me. Professor Martineau had been listening with intense concentration, clearly trying to understand how unconventional study methods had produced results that exceeded traditional conservatory training. "But Ms. Reyes, how did you ensure that your independent study was comprehensive enough to develop genuine musical competence? How did you know that you were learning fundamental concepts correctly without formal instruction and evaluation?" "By testing my understanding through practical application," I had replied. "Every theoretical concept I learned had to prove itself by helping me create music that accomplished specific objectives. Every technical skill I developed had to demonstrate its value by enhancing my ability to express musical ideas that mattered to me. My education was constantly validated through results rather than through grades or instructor approval." Dr. Morrison had been nodding as I spoke. That's exactly the kind of self-directed learning that produces the most profound musical understanding. Sophia approached musical education as exploration and discovery rather than as instruction and compliance, which allowed her to develop genuine musical insight rather than just academic knowledge. Maestro Chen had added his perspective, and her practical approach to musical education has produced capabilities that serve not just her own artistic development, but the advancement of classical music presentation more broadly. The innovations she's contributed to our programming have enhanced musical experiences for thousands of audience members. Professor Martineau had been quiet for several moments, clearly processing the implications of our discussion about alternative approaches to musical education. Finally, she had looked at me with an expression that combined professional respect with personal remorse. "Ms. Reyes," she had said, "I'm beginning to understand that my failure to recognize your musical potential 20 years ago represents a much more serious problem than simply misjudging one student's abilities. It suggests that my entire framework for evaluating musical talent may be inadequate for recognizing unconventional forms of musical intelligence." She had continued with growing conviction. "If I missed capabilities as sophisticated as what you've demonstrated tonight, I have to question how many other students I may have discouraged from pursuing musical development simply because their learning processes didn't match my assessment methods." The acknowledgement had revealed genuine professional growth and intellectual honesty, and I had realized that Professor Martineau was experiencing the kind of paradigm shift that could potentially transform her approach to musical education. My success was forcing her to confront not just her mistakes about my individual potential, but the limitations of traditional evaluation systems that might be failing to recognize musical talent when it expressed itself through unconventional channels. "Professor Martineau," I had said, "I think your recognition of these issues demonstrates exactly the kind of professional integrity that could help improve musical education for future students. The question isn't whether traditional methods are wrong, it's whether we can expand our understanding of how musical intelligence develops and create assessment approaches that recognize different forms of musical capability." Dr. Pemberton had been following our conversation with obvious interest. This discussion has significant implications for curriculum development and pedagogy research. If unconventional learning approaches can produce results that equal or exceed traditional conservatory training, we need to understand how to integrate those approaches into formal musical education. Ms. Foster had been practically glowing with excitement about the broader implications of what we had discovered through Professor Martineau's evaluation. And tonight's documentation provides concrete evidence of how alternative musical education can produce professional-level competence. This recording could be genuinely valuable for educational research and teacher training programs. As our small group had prepared to conclude the evening's extraordinary series of revelations and demonstrations, Professor Martineau had approached me with an expression that combined professional respect with what looked like genuine personal gratitude. "Ms. Reyes," she had said, "tonight has been one of the most educational experiences of my teaching career, though not in the way I expected when I first recognized your name in the program. Your willingness to accept my challenges and demonstrate your musical abilities has taught me more about musical talent and educational assessment than I've learned in years of formal professional development." She had paused, then had continued with obvious sincerity. "I hope you understand that my initial skepticism about your abilities wasn't intended as personal criticism. I was operating from frameworks that I believed represented professional expertise, but that apparently were inadequate for recognizing the kind of musical intelligence you possess." "I appreciate that acknowledgement," I had replied, "and I hope you understand that my success isn't intended as criticism of traditional musical education. Different approaches work for different people, and the goal should be helping every student find the path that allows them to develop their musical potential most effectively." Professor Martineau had nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of perspective that could help improve musical education more broadly. Your experience suggests that we need more flexible and diverse approaches to recognizing and developing musical talent." As we had gathered our belongings and prepared to leave the Berkshire Performance Center, I had reflected on the evening's extraordinary journey from anonymous benefactor to publicly recognized musical professional. The performance center that I had helped design and fund had provided the setting for a personal and professional vindication that exceeded anything I could have anticipated when I had first decided to support the project. More importantly, The evening had demonstrated that musical talent, like all forms of human potential, could survive and flourish, despite early discouragement, when given appropriate support and freedom to develop according to its own natural patterns. My success wasn't just personal validation. It was evidence that the musical intelligence Professor Martineau had failed to recognize 20 years ago had been real and valuable, worthy of development, and capable of contributing to classical music's continued evolution. The last conversation of the evening had been between Professor Martineau and me as we had walked to our cars in the Performance Center's parking lot. The November air had been crisp and clear, and the building behind us had been glowing with warm light that suggested the continuing vitality of classical music in contemporary culture. "Sophia," Professor Martineau had said, using my first name for the first time since our reunion, "I have one final question, and I hope you'll forgive me if it seems presumptuous." "Of course," I had replied, genuinely curious about what she wanted to ask. "Would you be willing to visit Whitmore sometime and speak with my current students about alternative approaches to musical development? I think they could benefit enormously from understanding that musical success can be achieved through many different educational pathways." The invitation had surprised me, both because it suggested that Professor Martineau was genuinely interested in learning from my experience, and because it offered me the opportunity to contribute to the musical education of young people who might be struggling with traditional assessment methods. "I'd be honored to visit your students," I had said. "But Professor Martineau, I'd want to make sure that my presentation emphasized the value of diverse approaches to musical learning, rather than criticizing traditional methods." "Absolutely," she had replied. The goal would be helping students understand that musical intelligence can express itself through many different channels, and that early struggles with traditional methods don't necessarily predict limitations in musical potential. As I had driven home through Boston's quiet streets, I had thought about the extraordinary evening that had transformed my relationship with the classical music establishment from which I had been excluded as a child. The performance center that represented my successful integration of musical artistry and technological innovation had provided the setting for a personal vindication that revealed not just my individual capabilities, but the broader possibilities for recognizing and developing unconventional forms of musical talent. Tomorrow I would return to my office at Harmonic Ventures, back to the work I loved, creating music that served therapeutic, educational, and artistic objectives that went far beyond traditional performance contexts. That I would return with a new understanding of my place within the broader musical community, and with opportunities to contribute to musical education in ways that might help future students avoid the discouragement and self-doubt that had marked my own early musical development. The remote monitoring systems that had revealed my business success to my late husband's family had been replaced by acoustic innovations that had revealed my musical competence to the instructor who had dismissed my potential. Both technologies had served to document capabilities that had been underestimated by people who had made assumptions based on incomplete information and inadequate assessment frameworks. But more importantly, both experiences had demonstrated that talent and intelligence, whether musical or otherwise, could develop and flourish when given appropriate support and freedom to grow according to their own natural patterns. My success was not just personal vindication. It was evidence that human potential was far more diverse and resilient than traditional evaluation methods typically recognized. The Berkshire Performance Center would continue to serve classical music programming for generations, but it would always represent something more personal to me. The space where I had finally been able to demonstrate that the musical intelligence Professor Martineau had failed to recognize in her 11-year-old student had been real and valuable all along, worthy of development and capable of contributing to the art form's continued evolution. Professor Martineau's challenge had become my vindication, her skepticism had become my opportunity, and her assessment methods had become the foundation for a broader conversation about how musical talent could be recognized, developed, and celebrated in all its diverse forms. And tomorrow, I had a new project to consider: designing a musical education program that would help other unconventionally gifted students find their own paths to musical excellence, ensuring that future Professor Martineaus would be equipped to recognize and nurture musical intelligence whenever and however it chose to reveal itself. The months following that November evening at the Berkshire Performance Center brought changes I hadn't anticipated when I first decided to fund the project. Professor Martineau had kept her word about inviting me to speak at Whitmore Conservatory, and that initial visit had evolved into a regular consulting relationship that was transforming how the institution approached student assessment and curriculum development. Standing in the same practice rooms where I had once struggled through mechanical exercises, I now worked with students whose musical intelligence expressed itself through unconventional channels. There was Marcus, a brilliant composer who couldn't sight-read traditional notation but could create complex orchestral arrangements by ear. There was Riley, whose rhythmic innovations sounded chaotic to traditional instructors, but whose polyrhythmic compositions were being performed by contemporary ensembles worldwide. There was Chen, whose perfectionist tendencies had been labeled as anxiety disorders, until we discovered that her meticulous attention to harmonic detail was producing arrangements of extraordinary sophistication. Each student represented a different form of musical intelligence that traditional assessment methods had failed to recognize or properly develop. Working with them reminded me daily of my own journey from dismissed child to successful professional, and of the importance of creating educational environments that could nurture diverse forms of talent rather than demanding conformity to narrow definitions of musical competence. Professor Martineau had become one of my most enthusiastic collaborators in developing these alternative approaches to musical education. Her willingness to question her own assessment methods and to learn from students whose capabilities she had initially misunderstood had transformed her from a rigid traditionalist into an innovative educator whose techniques were being studied by conservatories throughout the country. The success of our educational initiatives at Whitmore had attracted attention from other institutions facing similar challenges with talented students whose abilities didn't align with conventional training methods. We had been invited to present our findings at conferences, to consult with music schools struggling with retention and student satisfaction, and to develop assessment tools that could identify musical intelligence regardless of how it chose to express itself. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome of that extraordinary evening had been the expansion of the Berkshire Performance Center's programming to include concerts and educational events that showcased exactly the kind of innovative classical music presentation I had envisioned when we began the project. The venue had become a laboratory for exploring how traditional artistry and contemporary technology could enhance each other, creating musical experiences that served both artistic excellence and broader community engagement. The center's success had attracted international attention, with musicians, acousticians, and music educators traveling from around the world to experience performances in the space we had created. More importantly, the venue had become financially self-sustaining, generating enough revenue through performances, recordings, and educational programs to support ongoing innovation and community outreach, without requiring additional donor support. My relationship with the broader classical music establishment had evolved from reluctant outsider to recognized innovator, but the transformation had required constant vigilance to ensure that professional success didn't distance me from the values and priorities that had driven my unconventional approach to musical development. I remained committed to living modestly, to supporting causes that mattered to me rather than seeking status or recognition, and to using my platform to create opportunities for other unconventionally gifted individuals. Harmonic Ventures had continued to grow and diversify, expanding our work in therapeutic applications, educational technology, and acoustic innovation, while maintaining our core commitment to creating music that served purposes beyond entertainment. We had opened offices in 3 additional cities, had been acquired by a major technology company for more money than I had ever imagined possible, and had been recognized as leaders in the emerging field of applied musical psychology. Yet the most meaningful measure of our success remained the same practical criterion I had used to evaluate my independent musical education. Were we creating music that accomplished objectives that mattered? Were we helping people learn, heal, and connect through carefully designed musical experiences? Were we advancing our understanding of how music could enhance human well-being and artistic expression? The laptop security breach that had revealed my business success to my late husband's family had taught me the importance of protecting privacy while maintaining authentic relationships. The acoustic innovations that had revealed my musical competence to Professor Martineau had taught me the value of demonstrating capabilities through practical results rather than through credentials or explanations. Both experiences had reinforced my conviction that talent and intelligence, whether musical or otherwise, could develop and flourish despite early discouragement when given appropriate support and freedom to grow according to their own natural patterns. My story wasn't unique. The world was full of individuals whose capabilities had been underestimated by people operating from inadequate assessment frameworks or limited understanding of how human potential expressed itself. The difference was that I had been fortunate enough to find alternative paths to developing my abilities, and successful enough to create opportunities for others facing similar challenges. The Berkshire Performance Center, the educational programs at Whitmore, and the ongoing work of Harmonic Ventures all represented efforts to ensure that future students wouldn't have to choose between conforming to narrow definitions of talent or abandoning their dreams of musical excellence. Professor Martineau had been right about one thing during our childhood lessons: musical education did require discipline, dedication, and rigorous study. What she had been wrong about was her assumption that those qualities could only be developed through predetermined methods that ignored individual learning styles and natural interests. My success had proven that musical intelligence could express itself through many different channels, and that unconventional approaches to musical development could produce results that equaled or exceeded traditional conservatory training when students were given the freedom to learn according to their own natural processes. The 11-year-old girl who had been told she lacked musical talent had become a woman whose innovations were influencing classical music presentation worldwide. The student who had been dismissed as technically deficient had become a professional, whose acoustic designs were being studied by researchers at major universities. The child whose musical instincts had been criticized as inappropriate had become an adult whose compositions were helping people heal, learn, and connect through carefully crafted musical experiences. Professor Martineau's assessment had been wrong, but her eventual recognition of that error had created opportunities for educational innovation that were helping other unconventionally gifted students find their own paths to musical excellence. Sometimes the most valuable lessons came not from avoiding mistakes, but from learning how to transform those mistakes into opportunities for growth and understanding. The Berkshire Performance Center continued to host concerts that demonstrated the extraordinary possibilities that emerged when classical music traditions were enhanced by thoughtful innovation. Each performance reminded me that my success wasn't just personal vindication. It was evidence that musical intelligence, like all forms of human potential, was far more diverse and resilient than traditional evaluation methods typically recognized. Tonight, as I sat in my modest townhouse reviewing proposals for new educational initiatives and therapeutic applications, I could hear the distant sounds of student musicians practicing in apartments throughout my neighborhood. Some were working through traditional exercises with mechanical precision. Others were experimenting with harmonic progressions that would have horrified their instructors, and still others were creating musical compositions that defied conventional categorization. Each of them represented a different approach to musical development, a different expression of musical intelligence, a different path toward artistic fulfillment. My role was no longer to prove my own competence despite early dismissal, but to ensure that all of them would have opportunities to develop their abilities according to their own natural learning processes, regardless of whether those processes aligned with traditional assessment methods. The remote monitoring systems that had accidentally revealed my business success had been replaced by acoustic innovations that intentionally supported musical expression in all its diverse forms. Both technologies had served to document capabilities that had been underestimated, but the difference was that the second revelation had been designed to create opportunities rather than simply to expose hidden information. Professor Martineau's challenge had become my vindication, her skepticism had become my opportunity, and her assessment methods had become the foundation for a broader conversation about how musical talent could be recognized, developed, and celebrated, regardless of how unconventionally it chose to express itself. The concert hall I had funded would serve classical music programming for generations, but it would always represent something more personal to me. The space where I had finally been able to demonstrate that musical intelligence dismissed in childhood could flourish into innovations that enhanced artistic expression for countless performers and audiences worldwide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.